of it if I can. And to answer that question first, so we go back to what Tyler was saying, and he was talking about we're not going to have perfection until glory and until the end comes. However, and Claude is going to be speaking on this at the Laborers Conference, Psalm 110. Jesus is going to be defeating all his enemies until the last enemy, which is death. So that's a projection. That's sanctification. That's going in a certain direction. And so if we're growing in Christ, then we're going to be growing in a direction where Christ is going to be ruling. The nations are going to be flowing to him. And so the more Christians there are, the more we're going to be honoring Christ, the more we're going to have theonomy. And so that's why it's an important subject to be talking about is what is it going to look like? How do we apply it? How do we apply it correctly if we're going in that direction? And you were asking about the circles that I run in or listening to. I don't want to speak for any of them. I just want to speak for how I'm understanding the subject. And so that's where I'm coming from, how I'm understanding the subject. So that's what I would say first on that. And I think you're hitting, Jonathan, a lot of where the rub is from the application on the horizontal level. And that's where a lot of the conflict and rub comes in. How do we do that? What does it look like? Is it coercion? Is it force, compulsion? And so I think if we go back to the question that I was asking a few minutes ago, Christians believe in religious liberty. I mean, that's where we are in America. That's where we were founded, and it's a Christian doctrine. I believe that religious liberty, and I believe that the law, and it's only God's law, will lead us to Christian liberty. And it also, and I think if we try to answer that question, I think it will ease the pressure of the objections that you were bringing up, Jonathan. Why do we believe in religious liberty, and how does the law of God lead us to religious liberty? And to bring in where Big John was taking us with the 1950s, in my perspective, and I could be wrong on this, but in my perspective, and I do, here have felt that sentiment. What if it was like it was back then? Of course, we don't know how it really was because we didn't live then. But it may have been a lot different than our perspective on it. But the perspective is, everything was so much more church-centered, and the laws were more Christ-centered. We have that mindset that everything was more, what's that? Leave it to Cleaver, or is that the name?
Yeah, leave it to Beaver. Yeah.
Leave it to Beaver.
Yeah.
We have that mindset about the 1950s that everything was just hunky-dory. However, it was church-centered instead of Christ-centered. It was moral-centered instead of gospel-centered. From my understanding. So I wouldn't want us to go back there. I want us to leave that slippery slope that America has got into and get back on the gospel train and head back in the gospel direction. And so we were in our discussion in the debate, or not the debate, but our chat room that we have, we were talking about the three uses of the law. And what is that first use of the law? It's a mirror. It's to show us our sin. It's a schoolmaster to lead us to Christ. So if we are looking first and foremost at the law in that light, then we are no longer showing partiality. We are loving one another. When we don't show partiality, there's no more racism. And that, and it keeps going and going. When we live in light of the gospel, because of we can see then our sinfulness, we are gracious then towards one another. So I am living in light of the law of God because I am being graceful to someone else. And I think one of the goals of theonomy, and I made this as a post, would be to get back to the simple few roles that the Bible does give the government. And you guys brought up some of those, which was to wield the sword. And then the other ones were or are to reward the righteous and to punish the wicked.
Yeah.
And that's very, what we like to say, limiting government. And we need to get back to a limited government. But then we need to decentralize government, have a limited government, and re-centralize Christ. And so that goes back into the sphere sovereignty topic that we talked about. We want to honor Christ and his law above all in my own life, in my family, in my church. And then it will just begin to spread into the other spheres of sovereignty, into the community, local community, into the government. And once it begins to grow like a tree, the top level becomes smaller in their reach, in their authority, in their influence. And we begin to have the rightful influence that we should be having all along. And I think that's where we've fallen short as a church, is that we are not honoring Christ locally at its smallest level and being that influence, because we see where the government is now. Our government that is of the people, by the people, for the people. No, they're for themselves, because we've not honored Christ here. And so I think that's why the theonomy issue is such a good and topic to talk about, is because if Christ is taking us in that direction and he's drawing all men to himself, then government should be heading in that direction as well, where eventually they will honor Christ.
So I think you're bringing up an important perspective on this,